This is Stephen Banker in St. Michael's, Maryland. This backwater town is on the banks of the Chesapeake Bay. This is where James Michener researched and wrote his latest book, Chesapeake, which, like many of its predecessors, made its way quickly to the top of the bestseller list. Who's Who in America lists James Albert Michener, born New York City, February 3, 1907, son of Edwin and Mabel Haddock Michener. But this information, like Michener's books, is half fact and half fiction. No one knows his exact birth date, but it is true that an unnamed baby foundling, who was to become a world-famous author, was brought to Mrs. Michener, a widow, in early February of that year. It was Pennsylvania, not New York, and the man who's listed as the father, Edwin Michener, had already been dead for several years. The story of how that baby not only survived, but became an enormously popular writer, with South Pacific, Sayonara, Hawaii, Centennial, and now Chesapeake to his credit, is one James Michener does not intend to tell. As far as he's concerned, he's just a lucky fella who happens to write a kind of book that makes people feel good.
Several people write to me every day telling that they do feel good about what I've written. It's a remarkable experience. I've fallen upon a way of writing that is exactly right for me. I don't think it's right for anybody else in the world. I don't recommend that anybody write the way I do. There are infinitely better ways, but I sure hit the one that was right for me.
And as far as we can tell, it's right for a lot of readers. At least they seem to be enjoying it.
It is indeed. The typical letter I get is one lamenting the fact that the book has to come to an end, because I spend a great deal of time creating a little universe in which these people can live, the readers, for a long period of time. And if they will get through the first 100 pages, then they are citizens of that little world, and so many of them write to me to tell me so.
Now, you said that you happened upon this way of writing it. You almost make it sound like an accident.
I believe it was. I don't think it's conscious. I had a strong background in history and a very good background in literature, and I've sort of oscillated between those two fields. You know, about half my books are nonfiction. And when I'm writing nonfiction, I wish I was writing fiction, and when I'm writing fiction...
You see the advantages of the other.
The other. So my writing is a blend of those two worlds.
On your background now,
yeah.
It's a very mysterious one. You were a foundling. How very unusual, especially for a person who's achieved as much as you have.
I had a very difficult childhood. I don't know who my parents were. I was brought up by a wonderful woman in a little town in Pennsylvania.
A woman whose name you took.
A woman whose name I took. She always had 7 or 8 foundlings or abandoned children in the house at the same time. I grew up in a wonderful world of friendship and love and robustness and riotous kids around all the time.
And people reading Dickens and Trollope at you.
And people who loved literature and who believed that the way out of the morass was education.
Now, how old were you when you were found?
I have no idea.
But it was very close to your birth.
It must have been very close to my birth. The papers that I had in order to get a passport say that I was born in New York State. But I know nothing of the circumstances, nor does anyone else.
How were you found? The cliched opening of the door, and there you are on the doorstep?
Most of the children who were brought to my mother's place were brought by the police. They were abandoned, or, as I now realize, many of them were children born of unwed mothers, and back in 1907, that was a dreadful, dreadful problem. And the woman was ostracized totally if it happened. So I think many of these were secret births that were sloughed off in this small town.
And when Mrs. Michener didn't have the money to take care of you and the other kids around, off you went to the poorhouse.
Yes, I had 2 or 3 fairly long sessions in the poorhouse when family finances just went to pieces. We lived at an almost poverty level for long periods of time. I recall that most vividly because I was perhaps the most attentive of the children and one of those most close to Mrs. Michener. And from an age of 4 or 5, I shared this.
Did it ever occur to you that your concern with the sweep of generations, the way one generation leads to another, might in some way, maybe in an unconscious way, be a product of your remarkable background?
You know, I never thought of that until the last year, and several people have asked me about that, and it's a perfectly logical conclusion that one was related to the other. If so, it was unconscious. I am perhaps more interested in history than I am in genealogy, but one leads to the other. It's the kind of story I like to tell of the great interlockings of values and interests. I would think this was accidental rather than thought out.
Anyway, you were a bright kid, you got scholarships, you went to Swarthmore College, you graduated summa cum laude, and you had a variety of jobs as an editor, as a writer, and so on, until you were 40 years old when you published, well, it wasn't exactly your first book because you had a textbook out before then, but it was your first book that was meant to entertain.
I never wrote anything much till I was 40. I wrote it in 39, at age 39, but published when I was 40, which is perilously late. Not very many people get away with that. And I might not have. I might have been one of Gray's flowers born to blush unseen, except that when I did start writing, I had a terrific head of steam. I knew what I wanted to say. I had a strong background. I'd read most of the good books of the world. I knew what writing was all about. So,
and being in the Navy and stationed where you were, time was on your hands. You're getting 3 square meals a day, right. And you had a typewriter.
I was very lucky to fall into the hands of a commander who desperately wanted to be a captain. It's in the Navy. And the way to do that was to have a whole lot of men under you, and I was one of his numbers. And that's all I did. I just sat there and wrote my first book.
So Tales of the South Pacific was published in 1947.
Yes.
And it won a Pulitzer Prize. Remarkable achievement to win a Pulitzer Prize with your first published book.
Well, believe me, that's a good way to start. And then Rodgers and Hammerstein read it once on vacation and decided to make a musical out of it. And it turned into one of the great musicals, and things were fairly easy after that.
And they gave you a piece of the action even though they didn't have to.
They gave me a piece of the action, which has more or less subsidized my writing career ever since.
So you waited until you were 40 to write your first book, and that was really all you needed to do because you didn't have to write anymore. But obviously, not only have you written, but you've written a great deal.
I'm sometimes asked if I'm a compulsive writer. I don't believe I'm a compulsive writer, but I certainly am a compulsive worker. I remember those early years very vividly. I've probably worked harder than I ought to have worked. Harder certainly than I had to, but I really don't know what the alternative is. I don't know what it would have been in my case, just to be a bum. It wouldn't be very attractive to me.
You don't live in a very rich way. You have used your money, to use your word, creatively.
Yes, I'm a Quaker, and I'm a very strong believer in Quaker principles of simplicity and helping other people. And my wife and I, at the end of every year, give away a good deal of our money because she and I are both children of American education. Without the American system, we would have been dead ducks.
I'm interested in 2 aspects of your philanthropy. You collect American art, which you give away, but it's American art. And also you have done some charitable work in terms of black studies programs.
Yes, my wife and I have made 2 collections of art, one Japanese prints, which we gave to Hawaii, and another large collection of American paintings, which we gave to the University of Texas. But one of the things I'm happiest about is that we gave the royalties from one book to a college for the advancing of black studies, because we felt the blacks were getting a pretty short shrift, and we would always try to do something like that.
I heard about you, this is only a rumor, tell me if it's wrong, that when you're through with a new book, or when you start on a new venture, and it comes time to sit down with your agent and the publisher and so on and so forth and swing a deal, and for James Michener, we're talking about the millions of dollars, that you do not drive a hard bargain, that you don't really care.
That is correct. Now, that has to be understood, however, from the basis that I've been awfully lucky. You know, I've had one good book after another. I've had one public acceptance after another. I would feel rather embarrassed if I shot for the top buck. I've always left that to somebody else. I have a good publisher whom I trust. I have a very good agent. Was a woman for many years, a wonderful woman. Now it's a young man. I let them do the worrying, and I would never allow them to go into an auction, you know, to the highest bidder. We set a reasonable figure and let it go at that.
Why is it that you have so consistently anticipated the interests of the American writer? First of all, when you started to write, recreational travel wasn't what it is today, and that's what you wanted to write about.
You know, I've often felt that if I had come along, say, 40 years earlier, I would have been an exotic off to one side. Americans weren't interested.
Richard Halliburton, perhaps.
Yes, I might well have been his successor. Not as charismatic as he, not as lucky with my books as he was. There's something in that vein. But I came along when the world was exploding and expanding. And if you went to my little town when I was a boy, we had one great world traveler. He had been to England once. And now if you go to that town, you meet a woman whose son is working in Arabia and somebody who's manager of an office in Bombay. That's a totally international community there.
I quote, you said, "We have junked our old beliefs without having evolved new ones." And then you went on to say that this is a potential for disaster.
Yes, I'm very worried about that. I think that a nation or a society or a family lives within certain bodies of tradition, and they had better be very careful to protect it and defend that tradition. I don't think you need to be locked into it. I think one of the best aspects of our Constitution is that from the beginning it was amendable. And I think things ought to be amended. But the great fundamentals seem to me to be permanent, inherited from probably 3,000 or 4,000 years of human history.
That's what I sense so very strongly in your books, that there's an interplay between the people and the land, or in the case of Chesapeake, the sea, that perhaps the terrain affects the people even more than vice versa.
You know, I've come to believe that. I'm not a strong believer in Ellsworth Huntington's theory that geography determines everything. I think he went too far. But it certainly determines something. And I think people are lucky when they live in contact with the land. I think the way the people in Washington, city across the way here, get all uptight if a half inch of snow falls. It's no great problem. If you had 18 feet of water, you'd learn to live with 18 feet of water, if you're sensible. And I am very perceptive of this as a human condition.
You respond to your environment. Not
I do.
Not you, Jim Michener, but whoever you are.
Yes. I think you're impoverished if you don't.
Yeah. It's interesting to see in Chesapeake how a couple of the characters are, well, one is a goose, one is a crab, and this particular thing that we're talking about right now, they fit in as well as any of the people do.
Yes. I think also that sensible human beings live in some relation to the animals that share the world with them. I believe this more strongly as I grow older, that I inherit part of it, and with my superior capacity as a human being, I can do certain things they can't do. But I'm terribly arrogant, and I think I shortchange myself if I fail to see that a caribou lives his way and a goose lives his way, and a crab lives his way, and that we are all dependent upon the bit of terrain that we inherit.
I like this remark that you made. What the reader most appreciates is the odd sidelight, the unexpected relationship. Well, this has certainly characterized your books.
That is true. You know, when I'm through with a novel, I do not have a clue as to what those things in there are going to be that catch the imagination.
Well, it's so fraught, full of detail, that there's so much to choose from.
There's a possibility. But you know, they center again and again and again on something. Readers in England, readers in Australia. I know in the book I did on Iberia, on my travels in Spain, I speak about going one night to an old monastery where there's a can. 5,000 people have written to me about that scene. Now, I had better scenes about the cathedral in Toledo. Nobody writes about that. In the source, I used the name Kerith, Kerith, for one of my characters. And I used 50 other names, just as good, but I had to get a form letter printed to circulate to parents. I sent one out last week about where the name came from, because they all called their daughters Kerith. There must be 500 Keriths around this country, thanks to that little invention. Nobody could anticipate what it will be that catches the imagination, but it's something to do with words and mood and intensity and how it hits them at that time.
This has always been the case, I guess. In Hamlet, it's the skull Yorick that people focus in
now,
on. And
who writing Hamlet back in around 1603 would say that the great line was going to be, "Alas, poor Yorick"? I mean, those aren't very good words, but somehow, wham, there's the human imagination, has always grabbed onto that.
How did you get the idea for Chesapeake?
I grew up near Philadelphia, and I went to college on the other side of Philadelphia. And when you do that, you always meet somebody who has a boat on the Chesapeake. It was about 50, 60 miles away, the northern end. And I used to come here sailing when I was a boy. I first saw it in 27. That means I was 20 years old. I sailed on it a good deal in the intervening years. I knew the water, but not the land. And some years ago, I decided to cut the Gordian knot, either do it or not do it. And we came down and rented a house.
So it was perking for a long time.
Oh, yes, for whatever 27 from 77 is. What's that, 50? About that time.
Now, you described the Chesapeake.
Let me say, I'm not joking either. If you saw all my notes, you would find 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the possibility that I might do something on the Chesapeake. But somehow these things don't gel, and you go on to something else.
And then at college you became so important.
Yes. But this is a great body of water, with Washington and Richmond and Annapolis and Baltimore on the other side of the bay, almost the center of our nation, and over here nothing, a little old backwater with wonderful bays and estuaries. It's a good combination.
You call it the world's largest estuarine sanctuary.
Yes, it is.
What does that mean?
Well, if you look outside my door over my shoulder, you'll see a rather broad river there. Now, actually, we call it a creek, and it is neither, because no fresh water comes into that. That's just a backup of the Atlantic Ocean. It's an estuary. It's tidal. We've got 2 feet of tide out here. And it's not a river at all, although it looks like one. No, an estuary is a backing up of the ocean, and that's why we have crabs and oysters.
Where the tide meets the current.
Where the tide meets the current. And it's an absolutely gorgeous area.
What does it mean when you say that you could never have written this book without the American library system?
One of the finest things about the United States for a man like me is that if you establish your credentials, you can go into any library in the United States and give a list of books that have been published anywhere in the world, and the probability is that they will get them for you within a week, and all you pay is the postage. The last book of any difficulty that I got was not found anywhere in the United States. It was a book by Rider Haggard, one of his smaller novels, and gosh, they found it in a little library in Wisconsin. There it was, and they forwarded. They were pleased to provide this service. This is a most remarkable service that our country provides, and it enables a man like me to sit right here and have all the books of the world at his disposal.
We were talking a moment ago about the value of tradition, and certainly you exemplify traditions of patriotism in this country. You were just talking about the excellence of the American library system. There also is in your books a shying away from violence and from violent sex. We see so much of that in other popular writers' works. Why so?
You know, this is a very perplexing question. If you look at my track record, I think it would be one that many writers would envy. You know, one book after another, top acceptance, 4 or 5 of them, the very heady.
But if you were going to manufacture a bestseller, you'd never do it that way.
No, you wouldn't write the way I did if you wanted to ensure a cheap victory. But I think those victories are very precarious. You know, I wouldn't trade my position with any one of the people who are making it the other way, and I wouldn't financially. What I do is so much better. What Saul Bellow does is so much better, and it pays better, and you have a better life out of it. What Bernard Malamud does, what Isaac Singer does.
But many of those people would use raunchy language and explicitly sexual scenes that you would not use.
Well, I think it's a matter of style. Everybody has to do what he's happy with. What other writer would spend 40 pages describing a goose?
Herman Melville, maybe?
Maybe Herman Melville. No, I think these matters of style are highly personal. And I don't think there's any hierarchy of values. Yeah. I don't think what I do is a shred better than what somebody else does. And a book that I had tremendous admiration for was Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth. Well, I couldn't write that book.
But rereading Tales of the South Pacific, as I recently did, I was struck, by a couple of things. One was for the horror you have toward violence and toward sexual violence. There are rapists in this book.
I have never thought that the beauty of life had to be obtained through violence, either criminal or sexual. I've known quite a few wonderful women in my day. None of us had.
That's another thing. You were a women's liberationist long before the cause had that name.
I would say yes. That when a woman lawyer came to our town, it was shocking, and I was her first customer because I felt, my gosh, if that girl's brave enough to crack this nut, then she deserves my patronage. The same, I had a woman agent. I have a woman manager. I have a woman who looks after my affairs. I just think that we've reached a period when the old laws that characterized the Napoleonic Code and England 200 years ago are ridiculous, and I don't want any part of them.
But you are a champion of the downtrodden. You are a champion of black people. You are a champion of all kinds of Asian people. You are, and of course, talking about women, your essay, The New Mem Sahibs, which was an attack on the way colonial women exploited the people of the country in which they live, has been extremely widely circulated.
Several things I've written have been even more widely circulated than my novels, and I'm very glad of it. I have one little essay about not making up your mind what you want to do before the age of 35. That is, the perils and the advantages of drifting. I think if I had locked myself into some office job at age 17 and picked off one of the plums, it would have been a disastrously wrong choice. I have watched people drift past the age of 35 and have equally disastrous results. I think the problem of finding your niche and enlarging it and growing out of it maybe as you grow older is one of the great tactics of life, and most of us don't do it too well.
Why did you run for Congress?
I love politics. I love the hurly-burly of it. I have never been afraid to lose. I like
weren't you afraid of winning? I mean, if you had won, you would have put away your typewriter.
Several people have asked about that. I suppose I would have done something else. I must say I was very sorry about losing. I didn't go into it for any experience other than victory, but it eluded me. Later on, I've served in public life a great deal, and in other ways. I've run for election 6 times and won 3 and lost 3, which would keep you in the big leagues, but in politics that isn't good enough.
I'm fascinated by the, not only the detail that you fold into every one of your books, but the variety of subjects. I counted just almost randomly information on dinosaurs, on art, archaeology, paleontology, history, sociology, geology.
I had a very good education, I went to some 8 or 9 colleges and universities. It would have been pathetic if I hadn't learned something. But I also see life as a kind of reaction to available knowledge. I don't think everybody has to do that, but I think you better have in your society some people who do, or you're going to have a very drab society indeed. And certainly the testimony of people who write to me about my books is that they have appreciated going down some of these alleys. Some people don't. I think there must be many people who start to read one of my books and put it aside because it's too difficult.
Well, didn't you say that you purposely make the first few pages dull and heavy?
Yes, that is
shake the tree.
That's a specific tactic of mine. I want to make the opening pages rather dull and rather heavy to, as I phrase it, weed out the ribbon clerks. That's a phrase that gamblers use in playing poker.
Sounds like you're a terrible snob.
No, but I think there are a lot of people who ought not to bother with what I write. There are a lot of people who ought not to bother with what Thomas Pynchon writes. They wouldn't get much out of it. There are a lot of people who ought not.
But if the first few pages were interesting and engaging, it follows that the rest of the book would be interesting and engaging for these ribbon clerks.
Oh, no. The point is in the first pages, first 50 or 100 pages, and remember that I've published novels in which no human beings appear for the first 100 pages almost. That's the setting of the scene. That's the real solid underpinning without which I wouldn't be willing to go forward. And if people don't want that, they're entitled to reject it and to turn to something else.
What is the function of sheer length? What does it do to a book?
For the last some years, I have started every book with a determination to keep it short, because I know that there are many adverse factors to overlength, and I'm aware of them. But the fact is that when I start, then I want to see where he came from, who owned the farm, 800 years before, if that had any meaning, where the animals spend the winter. My interests really are very wide, and I am concerned about these. I love them. I study them. I find my own goodness in life in this, and therefore I have not been afraid of length. And I don't think very many writers are. I think they write to the precise length that they feel they need. Now, maybe a beginning writer would be very ill-advised to write a 900-page book because he's going.
South Pacific is a short book.
South Pacific is a short book, so is Bridges of Toko-Ri, so is Sayonara. But I suppose when I got my foothold and felt free to write exactly as I wished, I fell into this long expository form.
Now, when you're planning a book, there comes a time where you sit down and you sketch out what you're going to do. Tell me something about that process.
I feel that I work in concentric circles. I have 7 or 8 ideas that are good at any time, and then I winnow out some because I find they weren't too good to begin with. But then I wind up with 2 or 3 that are quite viable. And then one afternoon I say, okay, this is it. And then I begin to work on it. I work first in very broad outline and then narrow outline, and then finally pinpointing a few subjects that I'm really interested in. So it's a series of constricting circles. And when I get down there, I say, okay, this is it, and I sit down some morning and I start to work. I work 7 days a week, get up about 7:30 in the morning, go right to the typewriter, and 2 years later I have a book.
You say, after a year of research, I draft large divisions on 1 or 2 pages.
Yeah.
Of 14, 12 or 13 may work, I almost never miss.
This is after, 2 or 3 years of contemplation. I have shied away from each of my books, being very afraid of them. I didn't think I had the capacity or that I understood them well enough. If you look at Centennial, I started to write it in 1950 and never finished it. And I have not gone gallantly into this. I've gone with great anxiety of spirit because I wasn't sure of myself. But when at the end of this period I decide this is it, then I'm a professional and I'm moderately competent, and I say, okay, fella, now you put up or shut up. And when I do that, I have been through the hard part, and it is true I almost never miss. I outline it, and in my mind, maybe with just big topic sentences, and there it is, and 2 years later I've only modified 1 or 2 of them.
I know you don't look at reviews very much, but it must have got to your ears that somebody in the New York Times called you superior among junk writers, and I wondered how you felt about that.
I think that the summary of me will be that when I'm gone, there will be those books on the shelf in libraries all over the world, in homes all over the world. There won't be 1 or 2 of them. There will be 9 or 10, and this is a fact that's hard to dismiss. I'll stand on that. I think there are a few people who have produced at the consistently high level that I have in so many fields, and with such enormous popular acceptance.
Let me switch gears here. What is happening to the oyster?
The state of Maryland is to be highly applauded for passing and maintaining legislation that permits the taking of oysters only by boats under sail. You can't come in here with a big power motorboat and dredge the bottom of the bay because you would deplete the whole oyster population in 1 year. So here is a marvelous area of the United States in which if you have a sailboat, you can earn a living, and a good one. So what's happening to the oyster? 1, it's being very carefully taken care of by the state of Maryland. 2, the numbers are somewhat diminishing, but they ebb and flow. And 3, it's still one of the great delicacies of the eastern seacoast.
Well, of course, the Chesapeake aside, oysters are in terrible trouble elsewhere.
The oyster population has not been protected elsewhere as it has been here. We could wipe out our oyster production in 1 year, as I say, with no question. But we're not going to do that. We want to preserve a kind of balance. Whether we'll be able to in the years ahead with more and more sewage being dumped into the bay is a moot point. I don't know whether we can.
What kind of a creature is the oyster? Is he a survivor, or is he a rather fragile prima donna?
He's a very fragile creature. You know, a female oyster will lay these millions of little eggs, and they filter through the water, and unless on landing they hit something solid, they vanish. It takes about 5 years for them to become edible. I had a collection when I was writing of spat from, baby oysters are called, from the size of a pinhead to about 1 inch across, and their growth is very orderly, it's very difficult, and it's very chancy.
They look so sturdy, though, you know, in those thick shells.
I have a dear friend
who's an oyster.
He almost is. I have a dear friend who was an engineer in Pennsylvania, and he has his oyster farm. He has a body of water here, and he's enlisted the neighbors on about 1/4 mile either side of him.
But people say there are problems with oyster farms. Somehow the taste isn't the same.
He cultivates his the way you cultivate radishes. He moves them about, he moves them into the good water, and 5 years later he serves up an oyster stew, and it's very delicious indeed.
Well, is oyster farms the future of oysters then?
No. This is a hobby with him. And
more and more people are doing it.
I don't think it'll ever be economic. It's too long a time span and requires too much. And he does it for fun. I must say, if everybody's worked as well as his, it would be wonderful. He has oysters about 6 inches long that are extremely tasty and of absolutely top quality. But I don't see them coming up anywhere else.
You know, I made a couple of flip remarks here, but the truth is that I do sense that you have a kind of affection for the oyster.
I have an affection for this bay. I think it's absolutely wonderful that men in little boats, working as they did 100 years ago, can make a good living catching oysters and crabs. I went out on an oyster boat one bitter cold day last year, and I worked from 5 in the morning till 6 at night. And when I came home, I told my wife, I don't care how much you're paying for oysters, it ain't enough.
Well, here, as in the rest of your work, the philosophical question seems to be man who is transitory versus majestic, enduring, renewing nature.
Yes, I do perceive of the earth as a unit which has been here about 4.5 billion years and probably has another 5 billion to go before it's reabsorbed into the sun. I think that it's a majestic place with an infinite variety, but not an indestructible longevity. I think we can destroy large parts of it. I think we have to be very careful.
Because man not only is transitory, but there are greedy men, there are corrupt men.
Yes. I have a statement in one of my books that if there were one dinosaur left in western Oklahoma, some SOB would want to shoot it. I believe that thoroughly.
Certainly.
I think you could. I think tomorrow you could get people to close down the Niagara Falls or wipe out Hudson's Bay or anything else.
In Chesapeake, you have some modern history. Hitler, Adolf Hitler, is a character in your book, and Richard Nixon, although he doesn't appear, is very much felt, and people are very conscious of him. In fact, you even have one character who works for him.
Yes.
Some people thought, and some reviewers thought, that these passages stood out and didn't fit.
I would say that nothing in what I write absolutely fits. Where does the dinosaur fit? Where does the oyster and a hurricane fit? My books are about any damn thing I want to put into them, and I would always propose to do that. I mean, if in my next book I become looking at a brass lamp over your shoulder. If I become interested in the historic making of brass, you're going to have 18 or 20 pages on brass whether you want it or not. You're not obligated to read anything I write. Nobody's obligated to read what I write. But
it's a pretty good guess that a few people will.
Yes, I do have the feeling about writing that's very simple. There are many things I can't do. There are many things I don't want to do, and many things I don't have the capacity to do. But I do believe that if tomorrow morning, I only work in the morning, I sat down to describe a chair, I could describe it in a way that would make you read through to the end of the paragraph. That I can do, and that's about the only thing I can do.
James Michener says there are better ways to write a bestseller than the way he does it, but his method seems to be working well enough for the present. This is Stephen Banker on the bank of the Chesapeake in St. Michael's, Maryland.